Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I'm going to stand because I'm OCD like that, and I have to feel like I can see everybody and how you're all reacting to me. It's really mad. It's really wonderful to be here in many ways. This is where this project began, in Jerusalem at the Israel State Archive, the Central Zionist Archive. I was really lucky to have friends and people like Shirabi, who's here, who welcomed me in their homes and really made this work possible. So I would like at some point, perhaps in the discussion, to talk a little bit about my ongoing struggles with thinking and writing about Palestine and what Palestine really means for me personally, and what I find to be its most challenging aspect, which is how do we think about it as an exception, and how do we place it in its context? Where do we put in our own personal stories? And if you'd like, in the discussion, I can tell you a little bit about how just a month ago, several months after my book came out, the ghost of my great-grandfather came to me through a family archive that I didn't realize existed, and sort of re-narrated the story of my book to me, which was a very strange thing to happen. But before, I'd like to focus my talk today on really what has driven me, which is the possibility of politics. And in that context, I'm really trying to put this in the larger experience of revolutions and uprisings in the Arab world, particularly because I had the good fortune of being in Egypt, in Cairo, for 5 years, from 2009 to 2014. And this experience and this sort of multitude of experiences really informed how I was thinking about Palestine and how I was thinking about the work and its potential contribution. So here I think one of the things that's been very important to me to think about is, what do we do with this really powerful emotion of hope that many of us felt, particularly during the Egyptian Revolution. And I think for Palestinians like me, I had never really experienced hope as a political experience. I went out to demonstrate because that's what you were supposed to do, that's what your conscience told you to do. But I never really had the experience of expecting political change out of this kind of action. And I think what's been very interesting during this period of upheaval that was regional is that it really made us question a lot of concepts and theories that have informed how we think about our history. And as one very profound observer has talked about the period after this roller coaster of hope and despair, he's described it as a hangover. So we're very euphoric about the possibility of political change in the Arab world, the possibility of ridding ourselves of authoritarianism, and then only to face a very massive headache, right, in the face of a widespread vigilant Islamism, civil war, and the kind of catastrophic refugee crises that we see in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen, to such an extent that it becomes very difficult to think through the idea of catastrophe and Nakba in its Palestinian context without thinking about these broader contexts. And one of the things I think that happened in this period, there's two things that I want to talk about in terms of how this relates to the work and how I'm going to tell you about it now. One is what it did for us in terms of thinking about territory, and the other is what it did for us in thinking about the concept of Nahda, or awakening, or what I use as a shorthand for the Arab Liberal Project. So I think one of the things that became really a source of anxiety for many people during this period, particularly kind of foreign policy observers, was the purported integrity of something called the Middle East. What does the Middle East mean? How does the Middle East come together as a territory? And, of course, we have various renditions of that territory. This is Daesh's rendition. This is the Onion, the satirical Onion solution to the crisis in the Middle East, the 317,000 stake solution. It's supposed to be funny, but it isn't. And I think one of the things that has, in addition to sort of reimagining the territorial possibilities and the realities that we live in Palestine and more broadly, has also been this concept of Nahda. And it was very interesting to me the way during the revolutions this concept really reemerged. But actually it's a very old concept, right? It's not a 21st century concept. It's a 19th century concept. And in the 19th century until today, that concept has really been sort of described as cultural and literary. But I think it is much more intellectually and politically diverse. And today what I'm going to do is make the argument that the Nahda is very informative to the idea of Nahda, or awakening, or what we can shorthand as the Arab Liberal Project, is the idea of capital accumulation, private property, self-responsibility, financial investment. And I'm saying this, one of the reasons I want to put this forward, I have 5 reasons. One is because I really want to urge for a history of Arab economic thought, which until today we don't have. So for those of you who are students in the room, this is a big, big need. Secondly, I want to really question this subject of the Arab liberal subject that we have spent a great deal of time in the Arab world eulogizing. But actually, if we look more carefully, we find that Arab liberalism is very much alive and well. And my goal is to really try and critique that Arab liberal project for the kind of exclusionary categories that shaped it from the very beginning. Let me see if I got everything. No, point number 5. So point number 5 is to really try and think about the notion of wakefulness and sleep. And I think that this is very important for us because in all sorts of genres, revolutionary genres, counter-revolutionary genres, you find that this idea of wakefulness and sleep is really core, not just in the Arab world, but in Latin America and European thought. And I think it is a very problematic way to think about political change, to think about the ways, the kinds of demands that people make on the streets and in their daily lives. And the reason I think it's problematic is because, for 3 reasons. One is, I think it assumes, first of all, that everyone is asleep. And if we look at our history, actually people are resisting and making demands for change all the time. Sometimes we know those histories, sometimes we don't. Secondly, I think that it's also really assuming that there's some kind of latent essence that needs to be revived in order for us to move forward in history. And thirdly, I think this metaphor, this framework, what it actually does is really convince us that history moves in a linear way to some imagined final goal of progress. And these are some of the ideas that have animated how I've thought about my own work and my politics as well. So my story starts with a different map. This is the map of the incredibly shrinking Palestine. For those who do not have to be subject to the triumph of stupidity in the United States, most vulgarly epitomized in the figure of Donald Trump, but not only him. There's actually been several debates about this map because some major broadcasting media used it, and the sort of litany of charges that we've become accustomed to. But I think it's important for us. One of the things that this work is trying to do is trying to move between a map of Palestine and a broader map of the Arab world, and to really try to hold in place that these maps, these formations, are ones that are always under contestation and being struggled over. So my story begins in 1918, a bit before this shrinking is actually taking place, although partition is always already in process at this time. And here I just want to make one point, which is that there's often a kind of argument, ongoing debate about Palestine's historiographic exceptionalism. And here we become subject to what I find a very tired narrative that equates the colonizer with the colonized from the early 20th century until today. And I think it's important to keep in mind that one of the things that makes Palestine exceptional in its specific historical context after World War I as being subject to the Permanent Mandates Commission is that it is the only officially recognized case of settler colonialism in the Permanent Mandates Commission, although Daryl has really usefully given me some qualifications on that. But actually Palestine is, legally speaking, in the broader construct of the mandate system, which takes place after World War I as a way to deal with the former Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian and German colonies, Palestine is officially on the books recognized as a settler colonial case. So I think that, one of the things for me that has been really sort of fueled this project has been to really try and think about history outside of the all-informing lens of Zionism and British colonialism being the central focus of how we think about what were people imagining, what were people understanding about themselves. And the historiography on Mandate Palestine, so we're talking here from 1918 to 1948 roughly, has been very rich over the last 3 decades. It's shown a period of great social dynamism, an important labor movement, important populist politics, a feminist women's movement. But what it has been silent on is a growing and important kind of group of people who are really linking profit to progress in very interesting ways. And I'm a bit hesitant, and I got this from, I was very fortunate to work with Julia Eliashar, who's I think one of the most interesting economic anthropologists that we have around, who really pushed me to try and talk about these men that I've studied, and women, some women too, who you'll hear about, not by the terms that I wanted to give them, the capitalists, but rather what they call themselves, men of capital. So what's been interesting about looking at these men, this is the cover, in case you want to buy the book, I'll be happy to autograph it. Okay, what's been interesting, I think, for me about these men is the multiple ways that historiography has actually erased them as a possibility. So one of the ways that, of course, this has taken place is through the Zionist modernization narrative, which I think is very well illustrated in this image, where you have the electricity plant juxtaposed to camels, right? You have the backward subsistence agricultural economy in direct opposition to this industrialized Jewish economy, right? But actually, the picture is much more complicated. So this is one of the ways that the men I study, the men and women I study, are erased. Another way has been what I would call the flattened topography of Palestinian social life. And it's very fitting that we're in this space because this is the space of the Neshashibis, and the Neshashibis and the Husseinis have gotten a lot of attention in the historiography. And along with that kind of attention has been a way to portray Palestinian history as either being these decadent infighting notables on the one hand, mass of sort of ignorant but honorable peasants, and maybe a few workers in between. And I think this is something that has been really long in need of deconstruction. I think the picture was much more complicated. And for me, for those of us who are very interested in understanding the neoliberal moment, I don't think we can understand that dynamic without really looking at these earlier constructions of liberalism and their connections to capital. Is everybody with me? Are you bored? You're not laughing? Not yet. Okay, well, when you get bored, let me know. I can be entertaining. And the other thing I think that has been important, and people like Rima Hanami and who's here and many others have done really beautifully, is to really try and get us to question how our understandings of pre-48 Palestine have been contingent on a particular nostalgic way that we think about our histories, right? And I think we have to really fight this urge to celebrate the kinds of histories that get erased when we find them, right? That the real impulse is to critique, not just to recover. And lastly, I think there's a story in which people who are invested in profit accumulation, they're not my heroes, for sure. But there's a way that historiography and scholarship has sort of deemed it treacherous to study what we think are these compradors, right? These actors who were basically enabling colonial frameworks. And I think here the problem is, we're really good, especially in the Arab world, about talking about the left. The left is asleep, the left woke up, the left is paralyzed, the left is bankrupt, here comes the left again. And for me, especially in the last 6 years, I keep asking the question about the right. Well, where is the Arab right? Is there an Arab right? Do we take it seriously? Is there an intellectual genealogy? What were they reading? Who were they thinking with, right? So these are some of the kinds of questions that animated the work. So let me make two qualifications before I begin the story. One is that the disparity between these urban Palestinians, mostly urban Palestinians that I've studied, and the large majority of rural farmers or peasants was a very big one. And there is no way in which you can tell this story without attending to that disparity. The other disparity, which we should not ignore, is the wide discrepancy between the kind of capital and expertise that the Palestinians had and the kind of capital and expertise that the Zionists had. So just to give you a sense, from the 1920s, Zionist institutions are already basically producing 50% of the gross national product in Palestine. By the 1940s, that number jumps to 80% because of British-infused wartime capital. My perspective is to say, if you only look at Palestinians through the lens of comparing them to these Zionists, you will never be able to tell that story. That in itself is a faulty comparison, right? The comparison that makes sense is one between the Zionists and the British colonial presence. But even if you can step back from that and take a look at actually what is going on in terms of Palestinian economic production, you find a story that is far from the kind of static, unchanging world that we have been really inculcated with in scholarship and even, I think, in daily life. And here I just want to say, in Arabic and in English, the ease with which we use terms like aristocrats or ethnic, right, which is a very specific historical construct that doesn't make sense in most places, right? And so I think these kinds of things are concepts we need to break down. So what is the issue here? The issue is that since the late Ottoman period, you have a historically constituted commercial class that is separate from the landed gentry. What do we do with these people? How do we make sense of them, right? And if, I won't bore you with the numbers and the details, but if you look at the kinds of trajectories of the people that I studied from the late Ottoman period up until the 1940s, you find a very active group of commercial and later on industrializing ventures. And you see these changes very, very clearly beginning in the 1930s, which is basically where my story starts, and then very much intensifying in the 1940s. And during this period, the two Arab banks in this period, the Arab Bank and the Arab Agricultural Bank, grow faster than any other financial institution at the time. The number of Arab industries in this period, as well as the labor force, more than doubles. You also have these groups of men that I'm calling men of capital that established corporations, companies that would later become and continue to be some of the most important corporations in the Middle East. And some of these would be the Arab Bank, Arabia Insurance, Middle East Airlines. All of these are ventures that actually begin in Palestine. And what's also very interesting, one of the things that happened to me as I was doing this work was I would be here in Palestine, or I'd be in the United States, and people would tell me, I'd say, I'm doing this project on what I was loosely calling the middle class, and people would say, oh, they didn't exist. That didn't happen. If they did exist, they failed, right? And not worthy then of study. But what's the interesting thing about these guys, like Fuad Saba, who you're going to hear a bit more about, is that after 1948, they actually become the vanguard of new innovations in banking, insurance, investment, and contracting, particularly in the Gulf, but all throughout the Arab world. And I think their stories are important to the history of Palestine and also to Middle East history more broadly. I'm going to have some water. Okay, so as I said, the reason that I call these people men of capital is because I think it gives me much more space to understand and think about their worlds. And they were very much in kind of multiple universes of thought. Okay, so they're translating socialist thinkers. They're not just translating Smith. They're translating all sorts of different kinds of exchanges. They're figuring themselves out. And this led me to believe that perhaps one of the kinds of challenges that if you work on what is still unfortunately in North American academy called the non-West, very problematic, right? Because it's defining by what we're not. And I think one of the things that is very important to keep in mind for people who study the non-West, quote unquote, and what we can give back to these sort of more normative readings is that these categories that we're given actually don't work, right? I mean, even if you look back to the work of somebody like E.P. Thompson, who says when he's talking about the English working class, it's their very fuzziness, the fact that you can't actually put your finger on them, that makes them so interesting, right? So what I would suggest for people who are students in the room is your problem is your friend, right? Because when I started reading these guys, and then I was like, perfect, project accumulation. These are the people I really need to bring out to the light. And then I find they're translating socialists. Oh God, I don't know what I'm doing this, right? But the thing about it is that it's precisely that ambiguity that can help us understand the multiple possibilities of the moment, intellectually and otherwise. So this is a journal that I've spent a great deal of time with, translating, reading, photographing, scanning. It was actually a gift from my friend Munir Fakhreddin, who accidentally found it in the Hebrew University library. And it's called Al-Iqtisadiyat Al-Arabiyya. It begins in 1935, and as a bi-monthly, it becomes a weekly until 1937. It's discontinued in 1937 because this sweet-looking, innocent man, Fuad Saba, who doesn't turn out to be quite so innocent, is actually exiled in 1937 because of his support of the Arab revolt and the guerrillas. And this is a very important relationship that I think we can think a lot more about. What do we do with these people who are successful businessmen who are funding our struggle? It doesn't just happen in the 1930s. It continues to be something that goes on until, arguably until today. So who is this guy? Fuad Saba is the first licensed accountant in British-ruled Palestine. He begins in the 1920s, a company called Saba and Company, an accounting firm, which continues to be today a multi-corporation. I have the pleasure of speaking with his grandson, who found me online, who was probably Googling himself, and he's got the same name as his grandfather, so he probably put in Fuad Saba and found this weird woman who's writing about his grandfather, and emails me and says, what do you know, can we talk? And turns out to be incredibly generous. And this photograph is actually from their family archive. And what he tells me is the way that Saba was very much understood himself as, in this corporation, really trying to embrace Arab talent, right? And really trying to make his space as one where he could be enriching next generations. So let me go back to the journal. So there's two things about this, several things about this journal. You know, I've spent many years writing about this journal, so I can't say two things, but two things I'll focus on now. One is that they had their own territorial imaginings of the economy. These guys are really interesting, because this is 1935. They're translating from The Economist. And they're also seeing themselves as vehicles between the multiple translations that are happening in Cairo with the broader Arab world. They have subscriptions as far out as Muscat, Baghdad, Beirut. They really see themselves as a kind of small dot in a broader regional configuration. And in that regional configuration, what's been very interesting for me is that they are really imagining a very particular form of Pan-Arabism. Typically, the way we've thought about Pan-Arabism has been linked to a Nasserist sort of state-run socialist project, right? But actually, what's been fascinating is to think about the ways that there were these earlier understandings of Pan-Arabism that were actually linked to profit accumulation, right? That were actually thinking about financial investment. And one of the ways that they're doing this, that they're shaping up Pan-Arabism, is to use numbers and calculation. And for all of us that now live in the digital world, the power and potential of calculation really has far, I think, is more than we can imagine as individuals in many ways. But again, it's very important not to be presentist about these things. Calculation was an obsession that everybody was having in the early 20th century, because they were attempting to make sense of this broad abstraction called the economy, which they were trying to make into something that you could understand and read and calculate and hopefully, implement it so that you can finally get to progress, which is now quantifiable, calculable, right? So the things that these guys are doing, they are publishing commercial legislation, import-export figures. They are imagining, territorially and through numbers and through quantification, Egypt, Sudan. They're making these people, these nations, visible and comparable, right? But their understanding of the nation-state is an ambivalent one. They actually see the erosion of the Ottoman Empire as unnatural and dangerous for Arab trade. So what they're really trying to figure out is, how do we recover our free trade potential in this new nation-state framework? And it's also, needless to say, a very class-based project. And throughout, what you find these men are doing is constructing basic needs. Who has a need? Who has what kind of need? In class terms that they are presenting as almost biological. right? So a wealthy man needs to go out on trips and he needs to give to charity. A middle-class man needs to be able to have access to books and libraries and self-improvement. And a working-class man, he needs to have some cigarettes and some tea, right? And so they are really, I mean, these are sort of more anecdotal, but they're really constructing class in a very interesting way, precisely to guard what they understand is their civilizational superiority. And in these formations, you have basically the ideal man, and this is very interesting, again, in light of the flattened ways that we have learned about Palestinian history. So what you find in all of these renditions is that they are really urgently calling against ostentation. Don't be ostentatious. Don't overspend. You must save, right? You must be thinking about the future. How you make and save your money is critical to national projects. You have to embrace technology. You have to encourage enterprise, right? And there's an ideal woman in this story, too. And this is a funny story. This is sort of the networks of what it means to be a Palestinian working on Palestine. So my book came out in November last year. And I was at MESA, which is the Middle East Studies Annual Association meeting, for those of you who have not had the pleasure. And I run into Sherene Seikaly, and he's like, "Your book is out, I'm so excited." And I have it in my hand, and he's looking through it with me, and he said, "Where did you get this picture?" And I said, "The Institute of Palestine Studies, I paid $100 for it." He's like, "They don't have this picture." I said, "Yes, they do, Sending. You're on the board. Talk to them." He's like, "This is my house. How did the Institute of Palestine Studies get a picture of my house?" So Sherene Seikaly's house is in this book. But the reason that I use this photograph is because a part of what I'm doing is really tracing a domesticity project. So I spent a great deal of time with a woman named Sherene Seikaly, who ran a program called The New Arab Home. I developed a very healthy love-hate relationship with her because she reminded me so deeply of myself, because she was obsessively clean, constantly calculating. She had notebooks in every room. She had to write everything down, clocks everywhere, time yourself, calculate how much you spend, right? And I suddenly feel how the legacies of this women's sort of reform project on my own character. And her project is very interesting, and here I think I want to sort of step back a little bit and really try and suggest that one of the things that these men of capital and these what I call women of thrift are really engaging in is a broader international kind of framework in which people, again, are trying to make concrete this thing called economy. And so one of the things they're doing is formulating now economy in national terms. There's a national economy with a gross domestic product and a gross national product. And one of the very important sites in which these kinds of formulations are taking place is the home. Because the home, too, is a space of calculation, of surveillance, of saving and spending. It's excluded from the national economy, but it is developing in parallel ways. And I think one of the things I'll just tell you very briefly about is that in both of the projects in which I'm looking at what these men of capital and these women of thrift are doing and how they're linking profit to progress and all of these interesting things that they're doing, is that it is a very gendered project, right? And so the kind of man you are is very central to Exclusionary, and the kind of women you are, right, is very central to all of these renditions. So a good woman is not the muslifa, not the spendthrift who spends all of her husband's money, right? This is a character we know across time and geography. But it is the hasifa, right? And what is interesting about the hasifa is that she has this essential tendency to consume. And what you can do with that tendency is to guide it to local national products. Right? So as long as she's spending money on national products, we're good. Right? The other interesting thing, though, is the kind of gender constructions of men as well. So men also have a natural inclination, which is that they are quite tempted all the time. They're easily prey. They're easily prey to temptation and new possibilities. And so, so one of the things that was really interesting, definitely not word now. So one of the things that's really interesting is that Selwa Said is describing these kinds of unspecified houses of entertainment. And what is the woman supposed to do through her very minute management of the domestic space and domestic economy? She is supposed to keep her man at home. And here, the ghost of my grandmother came back to me, because my grandmother would always say, oh yes, so-and-so is cheating on his wife, and it's because have you seen her house? It's a mess, it's totally her fault, right? So this kind of understanding of your management of the home, your calculation of saving and spending, your capacity to provide a kind of ordered space as actually being your responsibility for your husband's fidelity. The other thing I think that's very important, so I'm going to switch now to the second part of my story. I'm okay, right? Before I do that, I think what's really important and interesting about these people is that they are, like many of the people around them, seeing a world of multiple objects for sale. And if you read some of the theorists who are really talking and thinking about political economy, they'll say that this is a very transitionary moment for understanding these broad shifts. When there's a plethora of objects for sale, a plethora of new experiences, right? So here we're talking about the cinema, cafes, restaurants, the radio. What's important to understand about these people is that while they are very excited about these possibilities, they also see them as a source of immense danger, because they are potentially going to damage the class hierarchy that they are so invested in both constructing and guarding. So the maid, the worker, the quote-unquote peasant can never be the listener or the reader in these accounts. So for example, in Selwa Said's renditions, she has in part of her program, she says, be careful because your maid might be listening. And if she inculcates a sense of self, you're really going to have to figure out what to do. This is going to be a problem, right? And the same thing is happening with these men of capital who, while they may be funding the rebels, while they may be thinking about a broader horizon of profit accumulation in a national framework, that framework is, by its very understanding of itself, exclusionary. It cannot be anything but vertical, right? It cannot be a horizontal type of understanding of social space. And this is ultimately what these businessmen very quickly understand. So now I'm going to take you to the second part of the story, which is to link it to the first part, which is that most of the ways that we have thought about how do we enumerate economy? How do we create categories that make sense of this object called economy so that we can calculate it and make it visible, right? The ways that people have talked about this is to say, well, it's growth. Now there's all sorts of new commodities for sale, so regimes, bureaucrats, colonial officials, they have to find ways to count these new commodities. What I found by looking at World War II in Palestine is that it is scarcity that is just as important as growth to new understandings and new calculations of economy. And so here I will start the story. Well, let me just back up for a second before I tell this is one of my favorite parts of my story, because it's very dear to my heart, because I've spent a good portion of my life counting my own calories, as I'm sure many of you have too, probably more the women than the men, but we could never say. Just as World War II is beginning, the British start something called the Middle East Supply Center. The Middle East Supply Center has a broad legacy for how government and private capital wind up building their relationships in the Arab world and the Middle East more broadly. The British are very concerned with making sure there is freedom from want. They understand how so-called bread riots can lead to upheaval. Their biggest failure comes in Bengal in 1942, when 3 to 4 million people died of famine that the British colonial regime could have easily avoided. Okay, so what they begin to do is, in the Middle East, they now create something that they are now newly calling the Middle East, which includes 52 territories and 100 million people. It looks nothing like the Middle East that we saw, or the Arab world that we saw in the maps of the journal that I showed you. It's at odds with other visions. And it also claims that we're the first, right? This is a very common colonial claim for many of us. We're the first to give numbers. We're the first to do indices. We're the first to calculate. And I think what's important is, even in this context of Palestine, which is relatively small, these calculations are already taking place. And so what the British are trying to do, basically, is to make sure that their shipping and wartime needs are balanced with keeping everybody fed, basically. And one of the ways that you can track this story is through the calorie. What I'm suggesting here is that the calorie, like the gross domestic product and the gross national product and things like the cost of living, some of us take to thinking about these terms, these calculations, as if somehow on the 8th day God created them. And they're, beautiful and universal and transparent, but all of these terms have really interesting histories. The interesting history of the calorie is how it is used as both a tool of social improvement and political containment. So what happens in 1896, when the calorie is invented, is that it makes food now a legible object, kind of like the economy, something you can measure, something you can calculate. And they're also inventing the categories of fats, carbohydrates, and proteins at this time. People don't like nutritionists. Governments don't like nutritionists because what will the link between poverty and malnutrition do? Well, it'll raise prices, it'll raise wages, it'll raise the dole, right? So governments are very hesitant. So basically you have these nutritionists, and they are madly looking for ways to fund their projects, their experiments. And they find in the 1890s their allies among a bunch of economic elites, who are at this time in the United States very besieged, because it might be very hard for us to imagine, but in the 1890s in the United States, there was actually a functioning communist perspective. There was a very interesting labor movement, right? There was labor struggle happening on the streets all the time. And so economic elites and these nutritionists get together and they say, what is the basic minimum that these people need so that we can keep them on the factory floor and off the streets? And this is where the category of the cost of living is born. It's actually born of this moment, of this imperative of political containment. The struggle continues, and again, if you're very disheartened by the triumph of stupidity, there is a moment in 1936 in the House of Commons in London where they actually have an 11-hour debate about whether poverty and malnutrition are linked. And they don't come out with any kind of consensus. What brings about the consensus? The needs of World War II, the need for laborers, the need for soldiers who are going to be well fed and do what needs to get done, right? And this is the period in which you have the League of Nations essentially standardizing caloric intake. And what they do in this project from the very beginning is that they scale down the protein, carbohydrate needs of Eastern people who they interpret as vegetarian in mind and less active than Western people, right? So the calorie that we understand as this universal and innocent calculation is by its very history constituted through exclusion. And I can tell you much more about rationing in Palestine and how it functions. Basically, it's an utter failure. My favorite chapter in this book is a whole very long chapter, the longest chapter on a vegetable crisis that takes place for 6 months in 1942-43. I spent many hours reading about cucumbers and tomatoes. And I was drowning in cucumbers and tomatoes for hours on end so that I could tell the story. And it's a boring chapter, but it's the best chapter in the book because it really gives you a sense of the kinds of failures that the British face, the kinds of resistance that the British face when they attempt to calculate people and things and objects and prices in Palestine. They find out not people don't use the metric system. Not only do they not use the metric system, they have this weird thing called the ruffle and the kid. And if you're in South Palestine, it differs than if you're in North Palestine. How are we going to calculate these things? Then, of course, they realize they don't have numbers for the Palestinians. They are confronted with the decades of apathy through which they have ruled this place and these people. And I think for me, one of the things that was, there's sort of when I conclude, which is soon, I promise, there's 3 things that happens in this kind of rationing regimes that for me personally were really expanded the way that I think. One is that the categories of people in Palestine confuse the hell out of these guys. So first they're trying to set up what they call racial expenditure groups. So they say, okay, there's Palestinian Christians and Palestinian Muslims. Let's try to figure out if they have different basic needs. Then they realize, oh, all these people eat exactly the same. That doesn't work. Okay, we'll put all these people as different. What do we do with the Eastern Jews? How they eat more like these people than the Ashkenazi, right? And so it's these kinds of attempts to universalize and make visible that lay bare all the complexities that are on the ground in Palestine and more broadly. The other thing I think that was really important for me was the parallel way in which the poor in London were demonized with the same language as the Oriental in Jerusalem. And thirdly, one of the things that I found most interesting in the kind of rationing and nutritional surveys that I read through were the ways in which, if you were to listen to these guys, most of financial, budgetary, and other problems were due to bad mothering and bad housekeeping, whether Jewish or Arab, right? And this is very important because I think if you are interested in broader questions of hunger and famine and wartime, you'll find, as the great scholar James Vernon has said, that women are always the ones who are responsible for managing hunger, and they are always the last to eat, right? And you see this in Palestine very clearly. In the 1940s, as this kind of infusion of capital is taking place in the British colonial system is attempting to create a command economy, right? Because what they're doing in the Middle East supply centers, they become the main buyer and holder of all goods. They buy, they distribute, they have taken over, right, this kind of command economy. And as this is taking place, you see among the Palestinian men of capital that they are now understanding their economic entrapment as a precursor for their national demise. They are also shrinking their visions from the future from a broader pan-Arab economy to a smaller Arab economy versus a Jewish economy in Palestine. And they are finally thinking about the Bedouin, the quote-unquote Bedouin, and the peasant as the authentic Palestinian consumer, right? At this point, it has become far too little, far too late for them to actually realize horizontal solidarities. Okay, so I'm going to make 3 points and then I'll conclude. One is to sort of resonate back with one thing I said earlier, which is the impoverished and the colonized for me are different but parallel objects of fear, hatred, and potential reform. So I think the resonance between the poor in London and the Oriental in Jerusalem is not anomalous to this case, it's structural, and we need to think about it in those ways. Second, one of the things I think that has most expanded my mind in this project is that we have been very, or I have been and many others, have been very tempted by Foucault's understanding of the panopticon, the colonial space in which everything you do is surveyed and it doesn't matter if you're being watched because you feel you're being watched and so you act as if you should, right? And the actual fact of the matter is that colonial rule is incoherent, it is messy, it is full of contention, it fails more than it succeeds in case after case. What do we do with that kind of failure? How do we understand it? There's much wonderful work by people like Adam Tooze doing work on the German bureaucratic obsession with omniscience, that if you calculate and you survey and you see everything, you become a bureaucrat that's all-knowing. My suggestion is in Palestine, they did not have those fantasies. The British did not fantasize like that. They went about calculating and making visible Palestinian economy and bodies and consumers simply because they had to, because of war, because of these exigencies, right? And as they did that, they understood very clearly what 2 decades of apathetic rule had meant for Palestine. And what they also understood was that the Jewish Zionist project far outstripped them in capital and expertise, at least in the realms that I studied, right? So these are the comparisons that we must make between the British colonial structure and the issue or the Jewish Zionist project. I want to then make a point about colonial development. So we think about development as something that's born in Harry Truman's 1949 inaugural speech. But development has a much longer history. And its history is actually linked to, again, upheaval throughout the French and British colonized world in the 1930s. So the Great Revolt that happened in Palestine at that time was not exceptional. It may have been exceptional because of its specific context, but there were broad revolts happening throughout. As a way to contain the radicals, the British and the French instituted a Colonial Development Act through which they established things like departments of labor, because they seek to bring the radicals into the fold of running the state. Okay? And here I think it is very important because I believe that nutrition and social welfare is part of the colonial development story, a part you cannot take away. And I think what's very important to understand is that there is a continuity between colonial development and nationalist development. The formula remained the same. You give the minimum to affect social improvement with the goal of containing politics. And I think here it's very important to keep in mind, again, how the categories that we understand as innocent and universal are through their very history constituted by exclusion. So here I will kind of end with 3 points and then an image. Palestinian men and women, the elites that I'm talking about, the kind of elites that I'm trying to draw out as different from the ways we've understood Palestinian history, they were not shadows of the Zionists and the British. They understood themselves as part of a broader Arab world, as a part of a broader Arab world engaged in a liberal project. My main contention is that it is time that we look at this liberal project not to mourn it, not to eulogize it, but to scrutinize it, to critique it for its very exclusions. And here I will end with the time that I actually submitted the manuscript, which was on August 14, 2013. And I was actually in Haifa at the time. And I submitted the manuscript, and I went back to Cairo, and I found that many of my students and teachers and mentors and friends and people that I had admired who self-defined as liberal were justifying, dismissing, or denying the Rab'a massacre, where Abdel Fattah al-Sisi basically killed over 1,000 people in a square for being followers of the Muslim Brotherhood. And for me, this actually crystallized how is it that Arab liberalism can actually lead to the exclusion of people from the very category of the human. Thank you.